Professor Gruen. Lori Gruen is the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan University in the United States. She is also Professor of Feminist, Gender and Sexuality Studies and Coordinator of Wesleyan Animal Studies. As her title suggests, Gruen is a leading scholar in animal studies and feminist philosophy with a primary focus on ethics, social and political philosophy. Gruen is a scholar. She is the author and editor of over a dozen books. Some of her significant publications include Ethics and Animals and Introduction, Entangled Empathy, Animal Crisis, co-authored with Alice Crary, Carceral Logics, co-edited with Justin Marceau, Ecofeminism, Feminist Intersection with Other Animals and the Earth, co-edited with Carol G. Adams. She will address us with her talk titled Decolonizing Ecofeminism. Her insights on the complex relationship between nature, gender, society, and ethics promise to provide a profound conclusion to our symposium. Now, before we proceed, as a moderator, I'd like to outline a few important details. Following Professor Gruen's 30-minute presentation, we will continue with the question and answer session. You are welcome to submit your question through YouTube comment section or the Zoom chat. Please feel free to send in your question at any time during the presentation. We will collect and present them to our speaker at the end of her presentation. After the question and answer session, I will deliver the symposium's closing remarks. Now, I'd like to invite Lori Gruen to begin her presentation.
Thank you so much.
Please.
Yes, thank you so much. I was going to present slides with this, but I decided it would be best technologically to just go ahead and present my ideas on decolonizing ecofeminism. And I will try to not speak so fast so that those of you who are interested in sort of following along can do so without me talking really, really fast. So, ecofeminism is a political and intellectual movement that is grounded in the belief that there are conceptual and structural and material links between the ongoing devastation of nature and the subjugation of women, other gender minorities, the poor, colonized, racialized, disabled, and other marginalized people, as well as non-human animals. The basic idea of ecofeminism, as I like to think about it, is that the exploitation and subordination of all of these different, of nature and all of these other people, as well as other animals, can't be taken apart, so that we can't focus on, say, only women or only on LGBTQ people or only on nature or only on animals. But that to adequately and effectively right the various wrongs that impact so many others, we must contest them together. They're structurally, by which I mean foundationally, linked. And when I say we need to address them together, I'm not suggesting that we always need to talk about them. They don't always need to be part of every assessment of every intervention, but that we need to be mindful of how, for example, generalized claims about the devastation of climate change are dangerous, even for different people at different animals at different times, so that there's differential effects of climate change. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that we can say, and we can focus on nature, we can focus on climate, or we can focus on gender oppression, but we should always keep in mind the ways that this is going to be experienced differentially by people who, or beings that are in different situations. Poorer people are going to have a harder time remediating problems from drastic weather events, for example. And so people's location, animals' location, their economic status, their social status is also always a part. So when we think about the devastation of climate change, it's going to affect different individuals, different communities, and different organisms differently based on where they're located. So ecofeminism gives theoretical expression to the practice of activists in many parts of the world. Women uniting with workers to protect children, for example, or to save trees, to protect other vulnerable people and animals, and to protest climate catastrophes. So making the connections between the exploitation of vulnerable, disrespected people and the more than human world helps to develop new ways of thinking about the state of global problems and paves the way for possible collaboration for resistance. Now, one of the important insights of ecofeminism is that the social, political, and economic mechanisms that are internal to capitalism explain the linked disdain for nature and the subjugation of women and members of racialized oppressed groups, as well as animals. Carolyn Merchant, who's not a philosopher, but is very historically, she's a historian and a scholar, a history of science scholar, in her discussion of ecofeminism, thought that ecofeminism provides a particularly helpful analysis of how, in early modern Europe and its colonies, the advent of capitalist modes of social organization went hand in hand with the use of nature and animals as resources, and with the subordination of women, indigenous people, and enslaved people. Capitalist expansion, she argues, coincides with a tendency to exalt production, often wrongly represented as cut off from biological and social reproduction work. Usually that work is associated with women and with others who are laborers who do the reproductive care, but also who are engaged in subsistence work. Now, another strand of ecofeminist thought asks whether domestic labor and the environment should be thought of on the model of Marx's conception of primitive accumulation. and so as structurally resistant to incorporation within capitalist economies. So the notion of primitive accumulation is the idea that there's something prior to the market, and there's free material that can be accumulated or extracted that doesn't have any market value. Now, the idea of primitive accumulation highlights market society's dependencies on prior assemblages of goods not produced through market relations. So Marx represents such accumulation as an act of great violence, famously declaring, with reference to the forcible seizure of the common land, conquest and enslavement, that capital comes into the world dripping from head to foot, from every pore, with blood and dirt. There's a long-standing debate about whether primitive accumulation is a one-time thing that happened ages ago, or requiring only this to set capitalist enterprise into motion. So that was already occurred, or whether instead it's ongoing. And there are some ecofeminists that maintain that the persistence of capitalism does depend on that regular appropriation or extraction of these free resources. And that puts both nature and women's domestic labor in a category of freely available resources, as Maria Mies, another important ecofeminist, has argued. So capitalist societies rely on the ongoing expropriation from the earth, from indigenous communities and animals, as well as on mechanisms for forcibly obliging women to organize their reproductive lives and domestic labor in a manner that will support the perpetuation of capitalism. And the perpetuation of capitalism isn't simply the sort of conditions of growing and more profit. It's also the social relations that are necessary for the maintenance of various kinds of markets. And the upshot is that women's social subjugation and the destruction of nature can be seen as products of interlocking social mechanisms. So ecofeminist claims about how capitalism devastates nature and appropriates women's labor without returning equal value has led to some ideas about internalizing those values that were previously outside of the economic system. But there are serious questions about the legitimacy of reducing this labor, as well as parts of the environment, to instrumental or exchange values. The reasons for skepticism about the legitimacy of this kind of reduction are clear when it comes to the use of animal lives and bodies. And I'll be talking a lot about animals, as this is part of my particular type of ecofeminism. We sometimes call it animal ecofeminism because we want to also highlight the importance of non-human animals in the context of thinking about a more expansive alternative understanding of social, economic, political, and philosophical relations. So we cannot properly pay off human debts for the costs of the use of animal lives and thereby internalize them, because animals are the sorts of beings who are above any price and should not be thought of as exchangeable or disposable. Respecting animals requires abandoning the notion that they are mere resources and recognizing instead that they are beings with dignity. Now, beings with dignity, of course, are beings that don't have a price, famously, as Kant clearly articulated. Now, ecofeminists bring into question the models of progress and growth that are central to the functioning of capitalist societies and urge us to see the dignity-filled values of both human and animal lives that are obscured from view by capitalism's logic of exchange. As the late Val Plumwood, an important philosopher and ecofeminist theorist, described in her essay entitled Decolonizing Relationships with Nature, which was published back in 2001, the sphere of nature has, in the past, been taken to include what are thought of as less ideal or more primitive forms of the human. This included women, of course, and supposedly backwards or primitive people who were seen as exemplifying an earlier and more animalistic stage of human development. Whether human or non-human, categorizing some as nature upholds a specific conceptual ideology of European colonization. This conceptual ideology is one that naturalizes the value dualisms that ecofeminists are critical of, but are often not assessed as products of colonization. Now, these dualisms, I just want to say, some people don't, it's not readily apparent what ecofeminists mean when they're talking about dualisms. And these are divisions between, for example, men, women, culture, nature, human, animal, black, white, rich, poor. That's what's meant by these dualisms. And so whether human or non-human, categorizing some on the nature side of the dualism upholds an ideology of colonization, as I was saying. And it is part of this idea that when you have resources that are not valuable, that colonization is sometimes thought to uplift these ideas of primitive people. So in one sense, we forget that this process of colonization happens even when it's not formal colonization by one state and another territory, and the colonization occurs by virtue of violence, economic control, those sorts of things. But one of the things I wanted to highlight is the ways in which even our minds can be colonized by these ideas or these ideologies. So our minds can get colonized by these dualisms that end up justifying and reproducing various structures or ideologies of oppression, including patriarchy and including anthropocentrism. So part of the decolonizing work that ecofeminists are doing is to imagine new relational grounds for political and ethical engagement that tries to transcend this dualistic structure. So the relational ground that I'm particularly interested in helps to think differently about our relationships with animals, the rest of nature, and with one another. So before we can talk about the relations that I think are central to understanding what has gone wrong in the colonization of our minds and of the natural world, as well as peoples, we need to look at the conceptual and ideological work that these dualisms or hierarchies perform in obscuring and undermining more flourishing relationships between humans and animals, and between humans and the rest of animals and the rest of the natural world. So ecofeminists have argued that we must expose and combat value dualisms that have structured our thought and our institutions. What, again, referring back to Val Plumwood, what she writes is that dualisms make difference the vehicle for hierarchy. It usually does so by distorting difference, end quote. She explains that a dualism results from a certain kind of denied dependence on the subordinated other. This relationship of denied dependency determines a certain kind of social structure in which the denial of the relation of the dominant and subordinate, that's the notion of value dualism, shape the identity of both. Analyzing mutually reinforcing logics of domination and drawing connections between the practical implications of power relations has been a core project of ecofeminism. Now, I'm happy to talk more about that because I realize that was a very kind of dense way of thinking about this. But again, I want to just identify these dualisms as culture, nature, male, female, or man, woman, mind, body, master, slave, reason, emotion, and human and non-human. And these are dyads that not only demarcate and perpetuate recognitions of difference, but also when we call them value dualisms, what we're thinking about is that they have a certain kind of power that are associated with one side of the dualism, and those on the other side of the dualism can be exploited or subjected to that power. Now, these dualisms, or what we could call binaries, excuse me, also constrain our thinking about other ways of understanding our relationships with each other, with other animals, and with the rest of nature. Now, another ecofeminist back in the 1980s, Yanestra King, suggested that the relationship between the subjugation of women and the subjugation of nature is supported by these hierarchical dualisms and must be resisted when they occur. And I want to just take a minute to highlight ecofeminism may not be known as widely, say, as animal liberation or as environmental ethics or those kinds of things, but it's actually as old. As I was saying, Yanestra King was writing back in the 1980s. Carolyn Merchant, who I cited earlier, was writing even earlier than that. So ecofeminism is not a new theoretical, practical way of thinking, but it is probably at least 50 years old, just like animal liberation is 50 years old, and environmental movements are a little bit older than that, but not much. So it's important to see that these aren't new ideas, even if you haven't heard of them before, or if there's a sort of resurgence. The important thing about my excitement, actually, I should say, right now about ecofeminism is that more and more scholars and activists are taking up these ideas, reinvigorating them. And part of this decolonizing ecofeminist project is to recognize the ways in which various forms of human oppression and the oppression of nature and the oppression of animals are fundamentally linked. So one of the ways that we need to address these links is by trying to decolonize our thinking. And this is part of what these binaries or these dualisms are doing. They're constraining our thinking about other ways of understanding our relationships. So value dualisms that empower one side and dominate the other actually are a central feature or necessary for maintaining structures that lead to oppression, both because they are exclusive and because they maintain a kind of fiction. There's nothing ontological or fundamentally real about these binaries. These are constructions that are created in some sense based on, biological difference for sure, but in a much more meaningful sense to maintain and recreate power relations. So the man-woman dualism inscribes, for example, this gender binary that precludes the possibility of gender fluidity. And it reifies a fiction that one must be either or, and fails to notice the fact that other than human beings, for example, fish, many, and other than human beings, fish is too huge of a category, but they don't constitute their lives by human binary conceptions of gender. And I'm always excited to read about the ways that some fish can actually change their gender based on the temperature of the water, based on the basis of how many different kinds of beings are in their particular school. That always excited me, reading about the way that some fish are able to change gender. Anyway, okay, so value dualisms and hierarchies rank beings in virtue of the qualities or capacities they might share with those at the top. What I mean there is that this happens a lot in the legal animal literature, where what you have is humans are at the top in the law. And if you want to include animals in legal process, you try to show the ways that animals have the same capabilities as those at the top. But recent work exploring parallels between animalization, dehumanization, and racism further illuminates why this kind of hierarchical thinking provides very, very troubling problems. Hierarchical ideology can appear expansive. So the men on the top may want to include people of other races in political community because they share qualities that those at the top find important, and they want to include animals in moral consideration because, like humans, they're sentient and experience pain and pleasures. But these hierarchical ways of thinking often get taken up by those who really do mean well, but they nonetheless erase other ways of living and experiencing the world and valuing ourselves and relationships. So in a sense, part of what happens in this hierarchical structure is that certain kinds of capacities that are important, maybe generally important, but maybe certainly important to the individuals who have those capacities, but those capacities are different than those at the top of the hierarchy, that we tend to ignore or overlook or occlude the kinds of special worth of those different ways of being in the world. So these hierarchies that set up different power relations don't simply enable, but also reify, as I said a little bit earlier, different forms of exclusion or discrimination, say in ableism or in settler colonialism or in patriarchy. And they're fundamentally anthropocentric, ultimately, even if it's mostly humans at the top. By attributing only human traits as valuable to the more than human world, we may end up ultimately just reinscribing the importance of our ways of being. And it's certainly very, very difficult, I would suggest, to include natural beings, natural collections, forests, rivers, wetlands, into a framework like this. And this is what ecofeminists are very concerned about. So ultimately, it's human qualities that become the pillar for holding up these kinds of hierarchies. Now, ecofeminism rejects these hierarchies and also rejects the notion that they causally explain the linked disdain for nature and the subjugation of women and members of overlapping exploited groups. So ecofeminists respond to environmental destruction and the interconnected oppressions by calling for a restructuring of our relationships with animals, with the rest of nature, and with fellow humans. Alice Crary and I adopted a new term in our book, Animal Crisis, which is called critical animal theory, to name this shift in perspective. Critical animal theory provides a radically different way of thinking about and talking about our relationships with other animals and with the more than human world. One of the differences is that critical animal theories argue that the divisions between humans and animals are not a natural division, but a conceptual division that privileges humans over other animals, and not only all humans. So some humans aren't at the top of that hierarchy either. And this divide or this division operates in a way that justifies the oppression of animals and nature and those thought to be closer to animals, humans that are thought to be closer to animals, which is often meant women, people of color, disabled people, and other humans who are outside of the privileged norm. Critical animal theory challenges that hierarchical structure that hurts humans, destroys nature, and can even be devastating to other human beings. So critical animal theory is a type of approach that builds on ecofeminist thinking to help us to imagine different ways of moving forward in our work to at least, well, to live different lives, but also to think about our relationships to the more than human world in much more constructive, decolonized ways. I'm developing a sore throat, a sickness this morning. I hope it's nothing serious. Respecting animals. I want to turn to talking a little bit about animals here. Respecting animals requires abandoning the notion that they are mere vessels for suffering or loci for interests. Ecofeminists have argued that the way that the logic of fungibility, exchangeability, central to capitalism, requires that some, or maybe most life, can be reduced to use, value, or destroyed. So we resist this idea that life, any life, can just be valued in terms of its exchange value. And often when I'm thinking about this, I think of this poor young giraffe, Marius, who, and I often talk about Marius, he was, as you might have heard, he was a 2-year-old giraffe in the Copenhagen Zoo, who they decided to shoot in the head because he was, there wasn't enough room for him at the zoo. So they allowed his parents to give birth to him. They allowed him to live until he was 2 years old at the zoo. And then they decided to kill him. And after they killed him, and this is at the zoo, of course, in Copenhagen, they performed a public autopsy of his body with children and families looking on. And then they fed parts of Marius's body to the lions at the zoo. And this autopsy was meant to be, at least as the zoo administrators described it, as an educational experience for zoogoers. But there's a fundamental question that we want to ask about: what were they being educated about? What was this education about? The zoo administrators suggested that the education was about nature. This is what nature is like. I would suggest that it's actually an education about disposability and our human control of nature. That's what I would suggest is happening. Just as an aside, the lions that ate Marius's body were later killed as well, because they wanted to make room for what they considered more genetically worthy animals in that zoo. And ultimately, this idea of killing animals like Marius and the lions was fundamentally about the gene pool for the lions and the giraffes. They said that Marius's genes were already well represented in the captive giraffe population in Europe. And so this was part of the way in which supposedly nature, this is nature now, which is reduced to this understanding of a genetic diversity, and the ways in which zoos can protect and preserve nature by protecting a diverse gene pool. This is, and then allowing themselves to engage in what critics called zoothanasia, which is another word for just killing animals in zoos in the name of genetic diversity. What happened, it's usually not done quite so graphically or publicly, but it is the way in which this kind of colonizing mentality, I would suggest, operates. The animals in this case, and I think it's a really illustrative example, the animals are seen as either useful or useless specimens. That's how they're understood. Are they a useful container of genetic diversity or a useless specimen of genetic diversity? Now, importantly, in the zoo context, where there's a certain kind of ideology of the protection and education of the protection of animals and the education of people about nature, that they're not thought of as commodities in the sense of market exchange. They're traded nonetheless. And this is something I think is really important to think about, because ultimately what happens is, even though there are parts of nature that can't be internalized, as I was suggesting earlier, into market exchange, they're nonetheless fungible, exchangeable. And this is something that Saidiya Hartman, scholar of the slave trade, suggested that enslaved people were captured, owned, and traded. But it's a type of property, and in that case, they were being exchanged. But she suggests that fungibility, the ability to be exchanged, happens even beyond that initial exchange of bodies and beings and lives and people through markets. A being that is a sort of property is a specimen. And I would suggest that the specimenification, turning a being, a living being, into a specimen, helps to create and has continued to reinforce the afterlives of both scientific racism, but certainly eugenic ideologies, and the continued exploitation of those that are deemed other. Zoo captives are disposable specimens par excellence. Perhaps they're interesting, perhaps they're beautiful, perhaps they're entertaining, but they're disposable all the same. We're in a power relationship over them, and that disposability is something that we're always able to engage in. And having these kinds, I guess one of the ways that I think this is a useful example. One of the ways I want to highlight this is another version of a colonized idea. We imagine often that through zoos, we're doing this great service for animals and ultimately nature. But what I want to suggest is that there's an ideology operating that makes it hard to see that in fact we're just reinforcing our colonized, dominating way of dealing with animals in the natural world. So this is part of what I think is really important, even when we're not engaged in a more overt form of, say, clear cutting or spewing toxic chemicals into the environment or destroying orangutans for palm oil plantations. When it's not that overt, we're still engaged in a form of colonization and domination over the more than human world, regardless of whether or not our intentions are good, or regardless of whether or not we think we're doing something to produce and promote and protect the more than human world. Okay, let me turn quickly to a way of thinking outside of that ideological trap, so to speak. And I realize this is not easy to do, and I'm not going to provide a blueprint for how to do it. But what the hope is that when we turn towards more care-centered relationships, which is another part of the ecofeminist sort of framework for resistance, that we look at both these relations, that we resist these dualisms and hierarchy, and we invoke a kind of caring relationship with others, and that can include other animals and the more than human world, then we might have a way of engaging in a kind of decolonization. So I would suggest that care can be a radical act of both love and resistance. Care-centered strategies of resistance can be pursued both within personal relationships and within the broader political sphere. We can create caring communities built on mutual aid, communal spaces, shared resources, and localized decision-making, and a shared desire for mutual thriving. And I want to give you the example of a particular individual who works with an organization, actually started an organization called Afro-Vegan Society in Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States. Her name is Brenda Sanders, and she works in this predominantly Black community, and this is in the US, of course, but there are also other activists who are working in Black neighborhoods in New York, in Atlanta, and in other cities to introduce healthy plant-based foods to the community. Now, this is somewhat remarkable, given that many people in particularly poorer Black communities often think of plant-based vegan foods as something that is white and done by elite people. But what's interesting about the work that these particular individuals are doing in these low-income neighborhoods in the US, where there's not very much access to food, particularly fresh, healthy food. We used to call these food deserts, but now people are calling them, calling the situation in poor communities, and I'm sure this is true around the world, a form of food apartheid. So there was one study done in New York City. This is incredible, I think, that found that a small local shop that has only packaged food, that there's 47 of those for any one grocery store, and that the lack of this kind of access to healthy, fresh food has ramifications for the health and well-being, particularly of people who are vulnerable to premature death. These organizations that I mentioned, Afro-Vegan Society and other organizations, are fighting against this threat. And as the Afro-Vegan Society website notes, many people have come to view veganism as both a viable solution to some of the challenges that they currently face in their communities, as well as a vehicle for resisting the systems that are responsible for creating these challenges that are the result of food apartheid in the first instance. So there's ways, very localized ways, of reimagining interventions into this colonization, the violent inequalities and vulnerabilities that occur in communities that are thought to be lower than the other communities that are at the top, that have access to healthy and fresh food. Animals in caring communities may be active members too, who can be part of a collective. And so one of the things I wanted to highlight is that there are sanctuaries, places where animals live. I don't know if there are any in Turkey, and I'd love to hear about that. But in Europe and in other parts of Europe and Western Europe and parts of all parts of the United States, even parts of Latin America, increasingly, and in Africa, in range countries, sanctuaries are becoming a very important site of care and interrelated engagement as the march of capital extraction runs apace. So I'll just give an example first of an African sanctuary, keeping mindful of time, and also of a sanctuary in Vermont in the United States. So in Africa, there's a number of chimpanzee sanctuaries and bonobo sanctuaries, and also sanctuaries or somewhat quasi-sanctuaries for elephants and other animals that are being devastated. Their populations are being devastated by the destruction of the natural world. When we're destroying forests, what ends up happening is obviously the animal's habitat is being destroyed, but ultimately animals are moving from one area to another. So when, for example, you clear cut in between these two areas, you end up fundamentally disrupting the social structure of these communities. And in that way, it's ironic, I'm just thinking of this now, in that way, interfering with their ability to reproduce because they internally are not going to reproduce with members of their own family. So this genetic diversity idea that I was mentioning that zoos were trying to engage in, they might do better if they were actually, if zoos were really committed to, the European zoos were really committed to genetic diversity. What they might want to do is focus on those areas of the world that are being, where habitats are being destroyed. I just thought of that. Sorry, that was an aside. Anyway, what I wanted to say is that in those range countries, one of the things that's happening is because the animals are losing their home, sanctuaries develop. And in those sanctuaries, even though the world for the animals who were in the wild and then ended up being displaced, even though that way of living has been modified or in some sense ended, they have a new way of being in which they're in these communities of care, these sanctuary communities of care. And there's also an example very quickly of a sanctuary in Vermont in the United States that it provides home for refugees from the food industry. So they live a very meaningful life with others, both other species and other members of their own species. And these sanctuaries not only provide meaningful, safe spaces for the non-human residents in their care, but they help us to reframe and reimagine our relationships with animals that have traditionally been relationships that have been characterized by power and control. In reimagining our relations with other animals, who are only now starting to be considered in larger social justice work, we open our minds to the expansive textures of exploitation. And in so doing, we can keep deepening our moral perception of the damages of oppressive social structures. In addition to being sites of empathetic interactions with others, caring interactions with others, sanctuaries are, in the words of anthropologist and animal studies scholar Ilan Abril, quote unquote, models of alternative modes of interspecies engagement, counter sites to the political economic arenas of animal use, that provide a clear vision of what living ethically with others might look like, a vision that can ultimately lead to transformative social change. Creating community and caring for those in it can also be conceived as a revolutionary form of self-care. Audre Lorde, the poet and activist, describes self-care as a kind of warfare, since finding ways to exist in a world that wants to destroy or diminish you or your community or the natural world in which you live is a radical act. And caring relationally can help us move closer to social justice. Ecofeminism may very well be what Alice Crary and I, in our book, Animal Crisis, call the critical theory of our time. It can help us see connections, forge solidarity, and build new forms of political consciousness that help us attune to the distortions of power that harm vulnerable people, non-human animals, both in the domestic case and wild animals, and the very planet that is our home. We're at a political and ecological crisis point, and we need to radically rethink our relationships with each other and the more than human world, and then act boldly to change course. Ecofeminism can help us to analyze the problems we confront and can also guide us in changing course by focusing on care, focusing on relationality, and hopefully have us act before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gruen. Thank you for your enlightening talk. Your presentation significantly enriched our symposium. Now, if anyone has any questions, I'm sure Professor Gruen will be pleased to answer them. Let me check the chat section. Oh. There is one from Özgür. Also, Güven Güzeldir is raising hands. I think I'll first read the Şükrü Argın's question, and then I give the floor to Güven Güzeldir'e. But it's a very long one.
It's a lot. Where is it? Is it written in the chat or is it somewhere else?
Yeah, I think so. Oh, there are some questions more. Let me read it in Turkish. Let me change I think our interpreters will be more successful to translate it. I'm continuing in Turkey. Günümüzde entelektüel alanda bilhassa
In the intellectual area today, especially in social theory,
pardon. Çevirmenlerimize soru atmak istiyorum.
I will be sending the question to our interpreters. Thank you very much. Interpreters are appreciating this effort. Okay, I read them. Today, in the intellectual area, especially in social theory, there is a tendency, and this tendency can be summarized as the breaking of the human arrogance and to remind human beings of their own limitations. But we also know that hubris can sometimes masquerade as humility. Can we find traces of exactly the kind of humanism that is opposed within this general anti-humanist tendency? When I read some anti-humanist texts, I inevitably think of a wonderful joke I once heard. I used to be arrogant, but over time I overcame this problem and now I am completely perfect. I wonder if there are similar moments in the anti-humanist tendency where arrogance disguises itself as a desire for perfection.
That's a funny joke. So I did get the joke. Yes, I think it's a really important question, and I really don't myself think that perfection is the goal at all. And I do think it really, in many ways, I think, comes down to one's recognition, I guess, that rather than seeing ourselves at the top of, as I've been arguing, is what ecofeminists argue, rather than seeing ourselves as the top of a hierarchy, that we are actually just one group, one kind of being amongst many kinds of beings, and that we can do better or worse, as it were, in terms of our relationships with others. So that nothing, I mean, the trying to achieve perfection is, I think, somewhat arrogant and hubristic. And I think that the idea then should ultimately be to try to do the best that we can do, and under conditions of always not fully understanding, not having epistemic access to others. We know that we can never really understand fully the subjective experiences, say, of another human being. I often argue that I think we're somewhat opaque to ourselves. It takes a lot of work to even figure out what we ourselves internally might truly desire, what we might truly believe, given the social forces that are operating. And I think that it becomes even harder in the context of other forms of difference. So I think it would be quite indeed arrogant to imagine that one could achieve a state of perfection. And one should, I think, ultimately take on quite a bit of humility in thinking about these things. Partly, what I think is important myself is that there's a way in which in our relations, it's not just me, it's you, it's the environments that we're in, it's the other creatures that are here. Everyone well, at least those who are experiencing the world have a perspective on the situation, and that perspective is probably quite different based on where you're located, based on your history, based on your upbringing, based on your economic status, based on the social institutions of which you're a part. So it seems to me that the notion of perfection is itself somewhat fictionalized. I hope that somewhat answered your question. It was a good question.
Thank you very much for reply. Ben Güven Güzeldir'e I will open you.
I will be leaving floor to Güven Güzeldir.
Hi, Lori. Thanks for.
Can you hear me?
I don't know if you can hear me. I
Yeah,
have
we can.
I have a fluctuating Wi-Fi connection. Sorry about that. So my question is this: yesterday, Christopher Schlottman talked about his suspicions on arguments based on naturalness. And he was quoting Michael Pollan, for example, who says that on the basis of naturalness, it's more natural and more ethical to eat meat rather than be vegetarian or vegan. I wonder if leaving the ground of naturalness so totally to people like Michael Pollan is a good idea. Because it seems to me that a very reasonable reading of ecofeminism also relies on naturalness to some extent. If you could own up to having that concept used in the way that it should be used. You haven't really talked about naturalness per se in this talk, but I wonder what you think about that approach.
Right. So my view, and I think most ecofeminist view, is that naturalism has gotten, at least in certain ways of understanding it, not all ways of understanding it, is part of a as tends to be used as part of a value dualism, and that insofar as it is part of a value dualism, can be used to reinforce various forms of oppression. Let me be much more specific than this. I'm talking in ideas, so let me just be specific about it. It used to be thought that there were two categories of gender or sex, if you will. One is male and one is female, and that naturally it used to be thought, or maybe still is sometimes, that women have less capacities for reason, or less capacities for professionalism, or less capacities, and this is natural. This was natural. I mean, back when Simone de Beauvoir said women are not born, they're made, this is a really important contrast to a more naturalized idea. And if that's what we mean by naturalism, that there are some natural differences, then I think that ecofeminists would reject that idea. The idea is not that women are necessarily or fundamentally or biologically or quote unquote naturally closer to the natural world, but rather this is a social construction that we've been placed as closer to nature, farther from culture. And I think that this is a really important dualism or binary to reject. Now, if we mean something different by naturalism, then there might be something to say. I think in the case of Michael Pollan or others, there's this other fiction, it's equally problematic, that was constructed about the great chain of being, or the scala natura, or the sort of natural food chain, or the natural order. And this is all, again, another way that for reasons of control, those in power, those who had power, organized our structure so that we think we're at the top, and those below us have less value, and thus can be used in different ways. And so I think that the notion of what's natural, which can be defined in many ways, it's a very vague term, sort of like any species term too, is very open and vague. What do we mean when we say that term? I'm not sure what it is exactly that this naturalism is referring to, but there's ways in which I agree with Chris Schlottman that this notion of natural is has been used often to again, to use my terms from this talk, to colonize our thinking about how to be in the world. And we need to ask questions about what it is that we're doing. Now, having said that, I do want to also say that I mean, obviously there's biological stuff in the world. There's no, that's not to deny that there is something here that is biological and that has a certain order and works in a certain way. And if that's what we mean by nature, that's somewhat detached from any value, obviously it would be, I think, comical to deny that. That's certainly not the case. There's things in the world, I believe there are. So, and there are biological processes. I mean, cells do certain things. That's what they do, quote unquote, naturally. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think that the use of natural and is the term itself can be quite ambiguous. And so depending on what's meant by it, I think one has to answer based on that meaning.
Okay, thank you very much. I generally agree with pretty much everything you said.
I'm glad.
Thank you for much asking, Professor Güzeldere. Now I'll read another question. Also with a remark from Neşe Aksakal. She tells about, we see the reflection of eco-criticism waves on the Turkish literature in recent years in the field of novels and short stories. These are texts of a deep return to nature. Nature is a great memory and a hero in itself. Nature is a whole with humans, writers such as Yaşar Kemal, Faruk Duman. And she's asking, I wonder if there are any such examples for the novel that you can share with us.
Really wonderful question. There are some science fiction novels that come to mind of Octavia Butler's work. And one of the reasons that that's popping to mind is that much of the work that she's done in the Parable series, it's a series called The Parable of the Sower, The Parable of the Talents. Maybe there's a third one that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. But these novels, they're somewhat dystopian, futuristic novels when the Earth has become something other altogether. But in those novels, I would suggest that there is an ecofeminist, even if it's not sort of really articulated in that way, theme, because the characters are empathic and they're caring and they're trying to build community in a way that is, at its core relational. And so I think that would be one example. It's such a great question. I'd love to think more about it. As a philosopher, I mean, I do read novels, obviously, but I would love to think more about what those might be. Yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you very much. Now I will ask another question coming from Zeynep Torn. Sayın Gruen, toplumda yaygın olan evcil hayvana sahiplenmesi hakkındaki
So may I ask you to elaborate on your thoughts about pet ownership, which is widespread in society? What happened to the little giraffe was terrifying. Considering the politics of private sphere, what do you think about animals imprisoned in homes? Was the question.
Yes. Wonderful, 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 and very, very difficult question. So I've been doing work for many years on the ethics of captivity. And I also I'm concerned about this in the case of non-human animals, but I also do a lot of work in prisons in the United States. I teach and help start an education program in the prisons in Connecticut where I live. And so I've worked with humans that are in captivity as well. And I have a volume that I edited called The Ethics of Captivity, in which have collected a number of philosophers as well as others who wrote about both the conditions of captivity for different others, and included some of the students of mine who are incarcerated, and then philosophical reflections on the conditions of captivity. It's a topic that's very, very dear to me, and I'm actually working on a book at the moment on zoos. But in the book on captivity, there was both a discussion of cats and whether or not cats should be allowed to go in and out of the home. And there's quite a bit of, in the United States anyway, quite a bit of debate and controversy about whether or not cats should be allowed out of the house. So when you said imprisoned in their home, I thought, yeah, cats are certainly that. I think that fundamentally, as long as there are domestic animals like cats and dogs, as long as they exist, it does make sense to provide them with care in the home. But I also think that it raises really fundamental questions about whether or not we should specifically breed animals to be captives in our homes. I think that we can provide meaningful lives for these captives in our homes. For example, I have a rescued greyhound who came off a racetrack. She would have been killed at 2.5 years old had I not, had there not been an organization that was available to take, who worked to take the greyhounds when they were not successful as race dogs. Their living conditions. I don't know if you have, do you have dog racing in Turkey? You do have dog racing. Greyhound racing? Is it greyhounds? Not greyhounds?
No, we don't have.
I'm not sure what the breeds are, but we have dog racing.
Yeah. So dog racing is a very, in the United States, it's going away slowly. There's only a few places that still allow it legally. But it is something where the dogs are kept in very bad conditions, and then they race, and then they're put back in the bad conditions, and then they race, and they're put back in the bad conditions. So the dog that I adopted was in very, very, very bad shape, and very timid and fearful. And one of the things that I'm quite happy about, although annoyed by as well, is that she's now very confident. She tells me what to do on a regular basis, and she's become remarkable in barking at me and then pointing to the drawer where, with her head, where I keep the treats. And she kind of has me totally trained. I'm trained to get her treats. I'm just a monkey with opposable thumbs that gets her treats out of the drawer. So all I'm saying is that I think surely I'm still in charge. I can say no, but ultimately I think that in the home, some animals who are, I mean, she would have been killed. I think keeping her in the home and having me her little slave is not a bad life for her, and she's become really quite confident in that. So I don't think that I would I definitely would not advocate special breeds. People, I don't judge people, but I mean, obviously I judge people. I'm a philosopher, but I don't like judge people like ethic. Like, I don't feel like I go out and give people a hard time for buying dogs from breeders. But even if I don't approve of that, but I do think that there's a way in which we can live reasonably well with others. And in that living, I also want to add this part of this idea of relationality that's so central to thinking about sanctuary, is it does help us to learn more about what it means to live across difference. And so that in another way, especially if we're doing it in a way that recognizes the needs, interests of the animals that are in our homes, and we do provide the best sort of care, I think that can be a very useful arrangement for both, even though I feel completely dominated by my greyhound.
Great. We have another question coming from Yağmur Sunar. Let me read it. I want to ask a question about ableism. You mentioned dualities. One of these is the hierarchy between able-bodied and unhealthy people. Based on these, my question is, how should the relationship between ableism and disability studies and ecofeminism be addressed?
Fantastic question, something I've been thinking a lot about lately. And I think part of what's so important, and this is particularly important for animal ethics as well, but it happens in a lot of different discussions. The idea of quote unquote normal needs to be wiped out of our discussions in ethical and political engagement with the more than human world and with each other. The notion that somehow there is a normal body and then an abnormal body. The idea of putting that normal body at the top of a hierarchy, I think is really fundamentally problematic. I think one of the implications of all of this is, and this is something that I'm having to deal with in my work, and one of the reasons I'm really interested in thinking about this really important question that you raise, is that we talk too about how to understand other animals and their well-being or their flourishing by focusing on what we call species typical behaviors. This is an ableist idea. Species typicality is just as difficult and problematic as notions of human ableism. So I haven't figured this out yet, but I think this is a site for working through the connections between ecofeminism and the anti-ableism. How do we talk about understanding each other across difference when that difference might mean a real difficulty in epistemic access to experiences of differently abled other? By which I mean, if you are a bird who flies, a duck, and you injure your wings so you can't fly anymore, how do you think about whether and how that duck experiences their loss of flight, and whether or not that gives us some insight or not about disabled people? Anyway, I think this is a really important question. It's a hard question. It's a question I'm trying to think about, because so much of the work in animal studies has been to try to understand what counts as flourishing for other animals. And in my experience, very little attention is paid to disabled animals, and very little attention is paid to the implications for thinking about quote unquote normal behavior on questions of ableism.
Thank you very much, Professor Gruen, sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. I think, but I think our time is limited, and I need to conclude the question and ask session. My apologies to those whose questions we couldn't address. I will now proceed with the closing remarks, but I'd like to thank you. We are grateful to have you. You enriched our symposium. We are looking forward to your future presentation and studies. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Now I will conclude with closing remarks in Turkish. Just a minute. Tekrardan selamlar.
Greetings once again. We have come to the end of the second International Philosophy Symposium titled After Nature, organized by Ege University Department of Philosophy. In this closing speech, I will try to summarize and evaluate the themes, discussions, and contributions of the presentations discussed throughout the symposium in the light of the initial objectives of the symposium. First of all, as Karun Çekem stated in her opening speech, the starting point of the symposium was a question of whether it is still possible, if necessary, to make philosophy of nature today. Because we saw that philosophical inquiry into nature was almost no longer included in the contemporary philosophical literature, the term philosophy of nature began to be used almost exclusively as a field of research specific to the history of philosophy, and thus referred to the work of philosophers such as Aristotle, Schelling, Hegel on the concept of nature. Interestingly, we know that at the center of the issues attributed great importance and urgency globally in today's world is an ecological crisis debate exacerbated by concerns about the rapid destruction of nature. Discussions on many aspects of this crisis, such as global warming, natural resource consumption, biodiversity decline, air, water, soil pollution, indicate that the damage has now reached an irreversible level. And as we have seen in the presentations, I will turn back to Anthropocene. It is stated that a threshold has been crossed in the effects of humans on nature in a way that a new geological age can be mentioned now. On the other hand, we thought that the limitation of the debates on the ways out of this crisis as technical issues that need to be solved quickly by scientists, largely due to the urgency of the issue, both broke the links between theory and practical struggles and eroded a philosophical questioning ground that could open the connection points of research in many fields to discussion. Therefore, as the organizers of the symposium, we set out with the aim of revealing how the philosophical inquiry into nature can contribute to establishing the meaning of the ecological crisis, starting from the premise that philosophy cannot avoid critical development if there is a crisis. In the light of this goal, we have tried to understand how philosophical inquiries can open the connection points and relations of scientific, cultural, moral, political, social, economic inquiries related to nature to discussion, and how they can contribute to the movement struggling in this regard for today's. Now, by the end of the symposium, I think I can rightly say that each conversation and the discussions associated with these conversations add an intellectual depth, different views, and various perspectives to nature-related inquiries. I hope this experience is equally enriching for you, was equally enriching for you. Moreover, in line with the aim of the symposium, I can state that each speaker offers important insights into the definition of the crisis experienced and how to get out of this crisis, and strives to reveal the options for thinking and acting differently. As a matter of fact, in this first session, well, actually, all of the presentation has enriched the discussions because they all had a problem. So let me make a summary from all the notes that I have taken. In the first session, Christopher Schlottmann's presentation on food and environment, titled The Concept of Naturalness in Stories about Food and the Environment, it opened the concept of naturalness used in defining the crisis of the current food regime and proposing solutions to the crisis to discussion. Schlottmann pointed out that today pre-modern agricultural practices are presented as a solution to environmental problems and how the concept of nature is used in the solution. However, given the high population and technology-based needs of the modern world, this approach remains inadequate, he stressed. He also noted that the naturalness argument does not focus enough on the environment and animal rights and is ineffective in mobilizing people. Schlottmann's presentation highlighted the need for more effective stories to help us better understand the current food crisis and find sustainable solutions. More effective empirical stories are needed in this regard. In the second presentation, it was Özgür in her speech titled Gaia Politics, Life, Politics and Science on Earth. She revealed how nature-culture dualism is questioned from the perspective of a number of thinkers such as Lovelock, Margulis, Haraway, Latour, and Leopold, and opened the role of earth sciences in politics and ethics to discussion. Çelik started by drawing attention to the scientific approaches that nurture thinkers who advocated the nature-culture continuum. In this context, we have seen Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, which considers all living things as active agents in the formation of the planet, and the views of the biologist Lynn Margulis on symbiotic lives feed the philosophical questions in the subject. Donna Haraway, who opposes the strict nature-culture dualism, also discussed the views of Bruno Latour and Aldo Leopold and conveyed important debates on how to establish commonalities, including non-human beings based on the earth sciences, how to think about gatherings, coexistence, and how to seek a policy including non-human perpetrators. And actually, in parallel with the beginning of the session, Mehmet, the nature as a concept is not that of an organic environment isolatedly taken into consideration, but there's an ontological context where humans and non-humans competition is at stake, but actually what is needed is to encourage philosophies of nature. Then came Mehmet Cem Kamözüt's presentation, Should the Anthropocene be the name of a geological period? In it, he made an important theoretical intervention on how to name and comprehend the crises in the contemporary world. He introduced the term Anthropocene, which is frequently used in this regard. He stated that this term is functional in social science fields, and the discussions revolving around this term are also valuable. But Kamözüt claimed that the term's function depends to some extent on its acceptance in the field of geology, and that this connection renders debates about the relationship between humans and nature inefficient. He pointed out that presenting the Anthropocene primarily as a geological term would lead to presenting geology as an authority in discussions on the subject and claiming that all social problems could be solved by an objective natural science. Actually, we had referred to it at the beginning. Moreover, Kamözüt claimed that those who proposed an alternative naming, such as the Capitalocene instead of the Anthropocene, would find it difficult to avoid this role assigned to natural science as long as they continued to claim that there were a geological term. Thus, Kamözüt argued that the debates around the term Anthropocene should be disconnected from geology. And then we had Özge Ejder's presentation titled Another Mirror Phase Narrative, the Identity of Mortal Human with the Inanimate Planet, in which she addressed how the Anthropocene age can be seen as an existential crisis, as well as pointing to a climate crisis that states that the Earth's crust has changed irreversibly as a result of human activities. This era refers to a period in which people question how they will survive in a common existential crisis and how their destinies are united. Ejder pointed out that the aesthetic side of the human-Earth relationship is as important as its cognitive and practical dimensions, and emphasized that in times of crisis, art can be an important way to respond positively. So Ejder argued that during the Anthropocene, art could help people make the planet meaningful for them, understand this crisis, and see the connection between their planet and their own existence by pointing to various examples. Thus, Ejder emphasized that artistic production can be considered as processes that encourage the overcoming of crises and the creation of a better world idea. And in the discussions, she also pointed out about how we could handle these. As we said, Rosemary Hancock could not realize her presentation due to health issues. Hopefully she gets better soon. Well, actually, we think that we will be able to add to her presentation to the presentations as video recording. But we can say that the presentation was going to focus on the context of environmentalist movements in Muslim societies, that she was going to open up the discussion in this regard about the Muslim activists and the critical communities. In our presentation titled Neurotechnological Developments and the Future of the Concept of Human Nature, Eylem Canaslan explained how the concept of human nature shaped in traditional philosophy has become obsolete with today's neurotechnological developments. While traditional philosophy is trying to find the features that distinguish human nature, that is, humans from other living or non-living beings, it has largely focused on human cognitive abilities. Can Aslan pointed out how the radical change in the interaction between humans and machine in our age, and the emergence of artificial intelligence-powered devices, have eroded the foundations of such a concept of human nature. Moreover, she emphasized that the rapid development of brain-computer or human-machine interface technology, which makes it possible to transfer, record, decipher, interpret, influence, and even change brain activities by communicating between the brain and an external machine, would lead to an even greater rupture, and there would be no point in focusing only on human-specific cognitive abilities. Within the framework of the developments, the presentation opened to discussion what the future of human nature will be. in a very comprehensive manner. As philosophers like Spinoza, just like in the criticisms concerning neurotechnological development, she actually referred to Spinozistic arguments. Elisa Altola started her presentation coping with climate acrasia. Can guilt and shame be morally effective? By pointing out that although there is urgent specific evidence about the climate crisis, societies are not doing much to take it seriously. Referring to the Greek concept of acrasia, the presentation analyzed the attitude of not being able to do anything and take action in the face of this crisis, even though we do not have the knowledge of this crisis, and opened it to discussion. Altola focused on two moral sentiments, guilt and shame, which she argued played an important role in our approach to the climate crisis, and addressed the claim that these sentiments were morally destructive. But she also explained how these emotions are necessary for effective moral action, and even stated that ignoring these roles is precisely the cause of this climate acrasia. By sharing the guilt and shame concerning climate events and in terms of what humans could do to contribute to these efforts. Finally, we listened to Lori Gruen's closing speech titled Decolonizing Ecofeminism. Explaining the ecofeminism movement, Gruen explained how other forms of exploitation and domination of humans and non-human animals, such as women and racially stigmatized, poor, disabled, marginalized by the continued destruction of nature. From an ecofeministic perspective, Gruen sought to show how analyzing social, political, and economic mechanisms as a part of racist capitalism can reveal the link between contempt for nature and the domination of women. Sorry, my page closed. Domination of women, the oppressed, and animals. Gruen pointed out that classifying some entities or areas, existences, like human or non-human, as nature has a structure that reinforces the value dichotomy, binarism criticized by ecofeminists, or dualisms criticized by ecofeminists, and confirms a conceptual ideology based on European colonialism. Therefore, in her presentation, Gruen emphasized the importance of studying the origins and effects of this conceptual ideology and considering strategies of decolonizing ecofeminism and other theories and practices. In this respect, Gruen's speech can be said that the symposium has a framework that brings together previous presentations on correctly diagnosing the crisis and revealing the ways to get out of this crisis. Finally, I would like to thank each of the speakers on behalf of the organizing committee for the presentations that enlightened and made us think about natural philosophy and ecology discussions. We would also like to thank all the participants who attended the symposium, those who actively participated in it, and those who asked questions and made contributions. Your participation contributed to the enrichment of these discussions. Finally, I would like to thank the organizing committee that helped us successfully complete the symposium, especially Karun Çekem. I would like to underline her, whose effort is more than the rest of us. I would like to thank Karun Çekem especially. We would like to thank our simultaneous interpreters, Barış Yıldırım and Müge Atala, for providing simultaneous interpretation services, and everyone who ensured the smooth flow of the event. We also owe gratitude to Melisa Karataş, who designed all the digital materials of the symposium. Also thanks to Istanbul Painting and Sculpture Museum for allowing us to use the work of Devrim Erbil on our poster. Finally, we would like to thank the Ege University Directorate and the Dean of the Faculty of Literature for their financial and technical support. In the symposium, we focused on the importance of natural philosophy and man's relationship, human's relationship with nature, and we hope to meet again in future events. Thank you all and have a nice day.